Good afternoon. Hey, Namari. Hey, Tamia. Hey, Brooke. Kendall, how are you? Ladybug, how are you? Hi. Hey, Sayesha. Maddie, how's it going? I'm doing good, thanks. I'm doing good. Good. Glad to hear. Halfway through the week. We're getting there. You're going to want to get your Module 2, Lesson 3 notebook open, right? The one we started on Tuesday? Yesterday? Hey, Trista. Edwin, how's it going? Good. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. Elena, good afternoon. Please go ahead and get Module 2, Lesson 3 notebook open. So if you're just joining us, go ahead and get your notebook open. We did 1, 2, and 3 yesterday, so we'll pick up where we left off today. Continuing to talk about the U.S. court systems. Good afternoon. Okay, while we're waiting for people to join and stuff like that, why do you think the Supreme Court is called the court of last resort? What do you think? Why do you think people call the Supreme Court the court of last resort? Any guesses? Why is the Supreme Court called the court of last resort? Give you a hint. It basically means what it's saying. So just put it in different terms. What do we think? Why do you think the Supreme Court is called the court of last resort? Anybody? They make the final choice. Yes. So in that they make the final choice, literally what the Supreme Court said, there is no other court. They are the highest court. So there's all these courts underneath them, but at the top dog, the top, king, queen of the castle, that is the Supreme Court. You can't go any higher than that. So good guess, Elena. Yeah. So, hey, Jeremiah. Yeah, you can't go any higher than the Supreme Court. So the reason they call it the court of last resort is literally there's no other higher court. Hey, Jaden. There is no other higher court. So what they say, that's it. You've exhausted all your paths. So a lot of times people are like, well, I'm just going to appeal. Well, I'll just go to the next level. Well, I'll just go to the next level. Hey, Darren. But Louisa, hello. But Supreme Court is it. So when we talk about the judicial branch, the Supreme Court is the highest it can go. It's the biggest honor and for sure the biggest deal, right? Because no one can override that. The only one who can override the Supreme Court is a later Supreme Court. So we've seen decisions change sometimes. One Supreme Court will do one thing and then a later Supreme Court will change course or modify it, but only the Supreme Court. Yep, the buck stops with them. All right, we're going to get started. I've got some stuff we need to go through today. I want to try to get as much of the notebook done. I've got your review sheet for you. And then if we have extra time, give you some time maybe to work on your superhero project, right? Because that's due on Friday, okay, from Module 2, Lesson 2. Hey, Angel. Module 2, Lesson 2, and stuff. So listen, end of the quarter, October 2nd. So that's 2 weeks from this past Monday. So it's not next Monday, but the following Monday. That is it. Everything closed. Anything that's still open closes for first quarter. Okay. It is absolutely the cutoff. So you really want to make sure that you're getting in Module 2, Lesson 2, Module 2, Lesson 3 that we're working on this week. That superhero project that's worth a lot of points. And then next week will be the final assignments for the quarter. Module 2, Lesson 4, and then the Module 2 assessment. Okay. So making sure that you are, especially those summative assignments, okay, because those will make the biggest impact on your grade. Okay. Any questions on end of the quarter or end of, what's still open? When we go into Canvas, go to the announcements. The announcement for Friday, it shows you what's open. Okay, so module 2, lesson 1, that's open till this Friday. Okay, but after that, it's module 2, and it'll be module 2, lesson 2 through module 2, lesson 4. Okay, so if you are behind and you haven't done module 2, lesson 1, get those in. Okay, superhero project, that's worth a ton of points, the most for the first quarter. So that's going to make a big impact on your grade. Make sure you're following the rubrics. I will say I'm getting quite a few that are not really following the rubrics. So you're going to lose points and you're going to be frustrated. And I'm going to say, well, please look at the rubrics. Make sure you're explaining your superpowers really well, picking out 2 roles. The weakness applies to the superpower. A lot of people are not explaining their superpowers or their weaknesses enough. They're not putting a title, like things that are really easy to get points on. Okay, so make sure that you're reviewing that rubrics. And stuff. Also, really quick, the counselor sent us an email this morning. They're discouraged because they have not had very many seniors register for the mandatory credit check. Okay, they said only about 1/3 of seniors have done that. So again, yesterday I went over this. I sent an email on Monday. You need to register for this. This is mandatory. That means required. Okay, so please find your alpha. All right, they're broken down by alpha, meaning last name, and make an appointment with your counselor. It's online, but you need to do that to make sure you're on track for graduation. Okay, so please, please give me a thumbs up if you've done it. Thumbs up if you've done it. So not very many people have done it. So you need to get this done. Good, good. Okay, so please, please get this done. All right, and stuff. We all want you to graduate. You want to graduate, so got to get this done. Any questions? That any question, or did you get it done?
No, I was just gonna ask, what are the is there any days that we can't do it? Like, can I do it for today, for instance, or?
So the window of time, it says it there in the announcement, it says September 20th through October 6th. So it just depends what's available on your counselor's calendar. So
Okay,
they're seeing people between today and then October 6th. I don't know what day of the week that is off the top of my head.
No, for sure. Thank you.
Yes, you know what I mean? So go to whoever your counselor is, see what they have open. And yeah, I would get it done ASAP, you know, so you can get it done. Yep, you bet.
Thank you,
Good question. Any other questions? Yeah, so it should be real quick. And the meetings, I don't think last too long, especially if you're on track. It shouldn't be that bad. It shouldn't be that long. Okay. All right. Awesome. Let's jump into module 2, lesson 3. Okay, so go ahead and get your notebook open. We started this yesterday. If you missed yesterday, remember you can go to week 7. That's where we'll find the document. Okay, so we'll go to module 2, lesson 3 for overview. So we're looking at the federal court system. And our learning intention is to the structure and the power and the layers of the U.S. court system, okay? So oftentimes when people think of federal court, they just go straight to the Supreme Court, not realizing there literally are hundreds of courts underneath that, okay? So there's a lot of courts that fall under the U.S. court system. Okay, we opened up our notebooks. You should already have that open, so you should be doing that right now while I'm talking. Go get that open. Okay, we did our supporting question. How is the court system structured and what effect does the Supreme Court have on the Constitution? So we copy and pasted that into number 1 in your notebook. We went through the 5 vocab words: jurisdiction, contentious, partisan, oversight, impartial. And then we looked at judicial review, okay? Can anybody tell me what was the name of the case that was so important for establishing judicial review in 1803? It'll be on your quiz. What was the name of that case? Or you can just look at number 3. Anybody unmute, put it in the chat. What was the name of that case?
Marbury versus Madison.
Good. Yeah. Marbury versus Madison. Very good. Okay. So it's this foundational case of what is the purpose of the Supreme Court, of these court systems. Okay. Because originally they would just help people or, you know, governments and stuff to interpret law. Okay. So take law and say, well, this is what it means. This is how you should apply it. But no one was really reviewing to make sure things were actually constitutional. So with this ruling, it gave guidance now that the courts were the ultimate authority, especially the Supreme Court, were the ultimate authority of whether or not a case is constitutional or not. All right. Yeah, it's constitutional or not. So this is a really, really big turning point, okay, for establishing the role of the federal government, or sorry, the role of the federal court system within that trifecta, the three different branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, okay? That they determine if the actions of Congress passing laws and the president are what they're doing constitutional, or does it violate our rights, okay? And can overturn that, can overturn the president, can overturn Congress. And that's a big deal to keep them accountable. All right. So we're going to pick up there and we're going to look at the judicial branch. All right. So go ahead and give me a thumbs up. You're with me. You have your notebook open and you're ready to go. Okay, again, if you missed class yesterday, you can go and you can get those on the video from yesterday. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. For anybody watching the playback, so obviously this doesn't impact you period 5 since I'm teaching with you, but everyone tomorrow, I'm going to be out tomorrow, right? So you might need to pause while you're doing some of the answers because you won't be able to get them from the chat like normal. Okay, so I'll try to go kind of slowly. Here I can zoom in my paper a little bit to help you out. Because I will be out tomorrow, Thursday. I'll be back on Friday, but I'm going to be out on Thursday. All right, so hopefully that helps a little bit. We like that? That helps a little bit. All right, so we're going to jump over into Canvas, okay? And we're going to look at part 4, which is what is the primary role of the judicial branch in relationship to the legislative and executive branches of government? And the second question, why is it so important for us to have an independent branch for this role, okay? So let's take a look in here, okay? So the framers of the Constitution felt the need for national judicial system. Okay, under the Articles, the courts, there was no court system. Okay, under the Articles of Confederation, remember the first version of a constitution. So when Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists, remember people who were pro-federal government, were trying to restructure this government and rewrite a new constitution starting from scratch. The judicial branch is arguably the least democratic. You know, it's not elected, it's appointed. What they say goes. There's no overturning it. It's not like we get to vote on it. So it is the least democratic. So there was a lot of hesitation. People wanted to make sure we set it up properly, okay? But we also needed a way to keep the president and Congress accountable and not just public opinion, okay? To stay the course, you know what I mean? That we don't abandon the Constitution in a moment of weakness or in a moment of we're having a hard time or something like that. To keep the Constitution at, the top of this country's foundation, all right? So we're gonna watch this quick crash course talking about the court systems, why it's so important, and then we'll answer these questions and we'll keep going.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. As fans of our series know, here at Crash Course, we believe in hierarchy. First at the top, you got me, then there's John Green, then Stan, then Brandon, then Zulea, then a bunch of independent contractors. Wait, I'm an independent contractor. Well, I'm still at the top. Anyway, then the rest of it's turtles all the way down, except at the bottom. There's an eagle. Anyway, it's the strict adherence to hierarchy that makes CCHQ run like a well-oiled machine. The same can be said for the U.S. court system. As you probably remember, because you're a smart rememberer of things, the American court system is hierarchical, which means any discussion of it cries out for a visual representation. Thought bubble, like Drake, will start from the bottom. The trial courts have original jurisdiction. When you realize that there are 50 states, each with its own court system, it shouldn't be surprised that the vast majority of cases start out in state courts. Of course, most cases never get to court at all. The vast majority of disputes, criminal and civil, are settled outside of court. How's that for efficiency? On the federal side, the trial courts are the U.S. district courts. There are 94 of them, with 663 judges, more or less. Sometimes in civil cases, a plaintiff, the person bringing the case, will have a choice about whether to bring that case in state or federal court. But you can only start in the district courts if your case meets certain important criteria. Almost all criminal cases start in state courts. So if you don't like the result in the trial court, and you have a reasonable claim that there was something procedurally wrong with the case or the way the law was applied, you can bring an appeal. Notice that if you start in state courts, you usually have more chances for appeal because most states have 2 levels of appellate courts, and the federal system has 1. Appeals courts can refuse to hear appeals, and if they do, you're done. One thing to remember, the a loser can always try to appeal, even if that loser was the state that failed in its prosecution. Federal appeals courts are called circuit courts, and there are 12 of them, distributed regionally throughout the U.S. You might guess that the region where your case is heard matters, and you'd be right. Judges in the Ninth Circuit, which includes California and Oregon, tend to be more liberal than judges in the Fifth Circuit. Federal appeals are usually heard by panels of 3 judges, while trials in the district court are before a single judge. There are 4 scenarios where the federal courts have original jurisdiction, and in all cases, they must be brought in a district court. They are cases where the law at issue is a federal law, like a claim against Obamacare. Cases involving treaties, which are by definition federal laws. These are pretty rare and really interesting. Cases involving the U.S. Constitution, for example, a case concerning freedom of religion. And cases where the U.S. government is a party to the litigation. The other type of case that can go into federal court is one involving more than one state where there's more than $70,000 at issue. This makes sense because if the parties in dispute are in different states, they might not even agree where to have the trial, and federal judges are supposed to be more impartial than state judges. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So thoughtful, so bubbly. If you read the news and pay attention to legal cases, most of what you see are lower court decisions, at least until the spring when the Supreme Court starts handing down decisions. These are the ones that tend to make it into the history books and that you may have even heard of. But how does a case get to the Supreme Court, Craig? Well, I will answer that for you. That's my job. Most of the time, the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction. In fact, it's the final court of appeals. If you lose there, you've really lost. When the court hears a case, it's called judicial review. There are, however, circumstances when the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction and can act like a trial court. So it's a good thing that most of the justices are, in fact, lawyers, although there's no constitutional requirement that they need to be. The court has original jurisdiction in cases between the U.S. and a state, cases between 2 or more states, cases involving foreign ministers or ambassadors, and cases brought by citizens of one state against citizens of another state or against a foreign country. What do these cases have in common? The main thing is that you can't imagine there being a single state where they could happen. This is especially true in cases involving foreign officials. And then there are my favorite Supreme Court cases, crimes committed on the high seas. That's right, the Supreme Court can exercise original jurisdiction over pirates. This is not as weird as it sounds because crimes on the high seas, by definition, have not happened in any state. So where are you going to have the trial? But most of the time, cases that make it to the Supreme Court are there on appeal. In order for the court to exercise its appellate jurisdiction, the case must raise a federal question. For example, one involving due process or equal protection or an important federal statute. If you don't know what those terms mean, don't worry. We'll get to them. Here's the thing, though. The Supreme Court doesn't hear a lot of cases. It doesn't want to. And I don't want to either. I understand. They also can't. And it's not just because most of the justices are kind of old. It's because there are only 9 of them, and they get requests to review about 8,000 cases a year. Out of these, they actually hand down about 80 decisions. So they have decision rules to weed out the cases that they don't want to hear. The first one is that there has to be a case or controversy, which means that you can't request the court to review whether or not a law is unconstitutional before it has gone into effect. There has to be an actual injury first. Another way of saying this is that the Supreme Court will not issue advisory opinions, speculating on whether or not a law might violate the Constitution. The second hurdle a potential Supreme Court litigant has to get over is called standing. Oh, that sounds terrible. I wouldn't want to be standing. No, this means that in order to bring a case, the parties must have a substantial stake in the outcome, which usually means an actual injury. Lack of standing is one reason that the court has refused cases about same-sex marriage brought by opposite-sex married people. The court will also refuse to hear a case that is moot. Mootness, which is a real word, I promise, I'm reading it on a teleprompter, means that the case no longer requires a resolution, say because one of the parties is dead. The flip side of mootness is ripeness. If a potential injury has yet to occur, the case is not ripe. It's like a hard avocado. Your guacamole, it's not going to be very good. It's best not to be too anxious about bringing your case. Most of the time you can wait, except in cases like Bush v. Gore, where we kind of needed an outcome so a new president could move into the White House. There's also a vague decision rule called the political question doctrine. In some cases, the court would rather that the executive or legislative branch handle the issue and not get involved. There are certain cases that the court will almost always take, even though all things being equal, they'd rather not. When the circuit courts have reached different or conflicting conclusions on the same issue, what's known as a circuit split, the court will usually hear the case to resolve the confusion. The court will also almost always hear a case where the federal government itself initiated the appeal. Finally, the Supreme Court will usually take a case that has a clear constitutional question, like one involving freedom of speech or religion, although there are sometimes constitutional issues that they feel are settled or they just don't want to deal with. For a long time, for example, the court didn't hear gun control cases, and nowadays they don't usually take obscenity cases. Okay, so that's the structure of the court system and how a case does, or usually doesn't, make it to the Supreme Court. What we haven't really discussed is what happens when a case does make it to the Supreme Court. We'll show you that next time when we take a shortcut to the Supreme Court by suing the ambassador to Switzerland for making such delicious chocolate.
Okay, so yes, the Supreme Court is the ultimate court. It's the highest court you can go to. They get petitioned to take thousands of cases, and the reality is they just can't do it. They take about 80 to 90 cases a year. And so the question kind of becomes, how do they determine which cases they're going to hear since they can't hear most? They try to pick cases that are unique, maybe a current hot topic that needs to kind of be settled, you know, that's causing a lot of divisiveness. Maybe where they see that there's a hole in cases. You know, when I say a hole, I mean there isn't really a previous case that answers this debate or this question in this case. You know what I mean? Because sometimes previous cases, you're like, this is just like a previous case. Here's your answer. You know, like it's repetitive. So they try to find one where it will help the history books for reference of, you know, what the decision or the clarification on the Constitution. So they try to pick ones that are going to not just be about you, but significant to the greater good of the country, since they do have such limited time. Okay, let's do number 4. What is the primary role of the judicial branch in relationship to the legislative and executive branch? So basically, their job is to look at their actions and decide if it falls within the bounds of the Constitution. That's the first part of number 4. Second part of number 4. So why is it so important for us to have an independent branch play this role? It's stuff. Okay, so basically they serve for life and are outside the political realm. Okay, so it allows for hopefully impartial judgments based on the Constitution and not political affiliation. So the reason that we don't want our courts to be democratic, aka meaning elected by the people, is we don't want people partial. We want people to actually follow the law and not feel pressured, right? If I don't go this way or this way to make my party happy, then I could be elected out. Politicians do that all the time. They cave, right? They do things to make their people happy. Sometimes it's better for the country, not always. Often, sometimes at the detriment, spending too much money. Sometimes the answer has to be no, but judges, that therefore they can be impartial. So that's part of the reason we don't want them democratic. So usually we love the idea of democracy and a democratic selection, but in this case, it can lead to bias. So let's go over the checking for understanding questions. Where's the judicial branch? Where in the judicial branch does it address the Constitution? So that's going to be Article 3 of the Constitution. U.S. district courts are, and that's the first trial courts for most cases involving federal law. So the district courts, there's 93 different levels of or different federal courts. So the very first level, the lowest level, is going to be on the district courts. How long do federal judges serve? So we talked about this before, for life or until they retire or impeach. So we did talk about that the other day. So once they are appointed by the president, unless they get it, they take a new position, they retire, they pass away, they have that position basically as long as they want to, and as long as they're not removed for impeachment reasons. So they can stay there as long as they want. Federal judges receive their position by president appointment. So we talked about this when we talked about the executive branch last week, right? The executive branch, one of the powers of the president is that they can appoint positions. So not just cabinet positions that are the leaders of each department under the executive branch, but also these judge positions. So Supreme Court positions and all those other courts. So whenever there's an opening, so they can't just go remove somebody and put somebody in they want. There has to be an opening, but then they have the power to appoint that person. Now it has to be confirmed by the Senate, okay, but the president can appoint. Where's the jurisdiction of the federal courts defined? Okay, so jurisdiction is going to be what is the boundaries of the cases out here. Sometimes it's type of case, sometimes it's geography, sometimes it's combination thereof, sometimes it's levels of cases. So is this an appeal? Is this the first trial? So there's a lot of things that determine jurisdiction. So in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. So anything dealing with the Constitution is going to be in Article 3 of the Constitution. All right.
I found this on the web.
Oop. My watch is trying to pull up Article 3. All right. So we're going to go to Supreme Court. So we'll look at number 5. Answer the following questions based on the content in the section. Why are Supreme Court rulings so important in establishing legal precedent? Precedent means looking at history to establish a pattern. Okay. It's kind of like, you know, if I'm going to go on, I get my driver's license and maybe I turn to my sibling and say, what did you need? and oh, I needed an ID, I needed a bill, I needed this, I needed to show that I had done my hours or something like that. So you look at precedent, someone else's experience, then to help determine what your experience will be. So the courts do the same thing. They will often reference other cases that are along the same topic or dealing with the same laws to help make decisions when sometimes it's gray, when sometimes the law is kind of hard to interpret. How do we define this? Okay. So let's take a look at this section in Canvas. So the Supreme Court has original and appellate jurisdiction. So it means that if you go to trial and you don't like the outcome and you appeal, you work your way up through the system. The highest you can go is the Supreme Court. So that means appellate jurisdiction. Also, though, in very special cases, okay, a case can go directly to the Supreme Court. All right. So basically they have all jurisdiction. All right. Any case could potentially come to them, but it has to either meet certain criteria or they have to choose it. All right. To get to the Supreme Court, there are several steps. Okay. So the case is fielded through the many levels of the district court. The case has been appealed in the federal court appeals system. So it's worked its way up. And then the case has to be selected by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has three options when a case has made its way all the way up there. It can allow the lower court's ruling to stand. So basically what they'll say is, we're not going to hear it. So whatever court level came before they petitioned the Supreme Court, then that lower level court decision will stand. Okay. They can send it back to the lower courts to be reconsidered. You're like, retry it. Okay. We don't have time. It's not relevant enough for our, precious time. So figure it out in the lower courts, resolve it. Okay. Or they can agree to hear it. So they can agree to hear it, which again, very, very few, less than 100 a year, 80, 90 that we hear. Okay, so let's watch this quick video and then we'll answer the question and go through the check-in for understanding.
Branches of government in the United States. Legislative, executive, and judicial. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and other federal courts whose function is to rule on all matters related to the law and the Constitution. The Supreme Court has enormous power that has continued to grow since its inception in 1789. The first version of the court had only 6 justices. In 1869, that number grew to 9 and has remained that way ever since. Unlike the other branches of government, justices aren't elected. The president nominates Supreme Court members, as well as federal courts of appeals and district court judges. The Senate then has the responsibility to vote and confirm or reject the appointment. Justices don't have term limits. They're able to serve until they die, retire, or are removed by Congress through impeachment and conviction. The Constitution itself doesn't give any specific requirements for who can and cannot be a justice. In fact, federal law doesn't even require a federal judge to be an attorney, but traditionally, most of them have worked as lawyers. And when it comes to the power the Supreme Court wields, the Constitution is, again, pretty vague. Section 1 identifies the Supreme Court as the third branch of government, and it empowers the court to decide cases. That's pretty much it. Section 2 touches on jurisdiction, and Section 3 spells out regulations around treason cases. There is no mention of interpreting the constitutionality of the laws, the very thing the Supreme Court is famous for today. So how did the Supreme Court get that power? The answer is an 1803 Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. The case is a little complicated, but basically, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the law Marbury was using to make his case was unconstitutional. Marshall's ruling established that it was the United States Supreme Court's responsibility to interpret the constitutionality of laws. And so the court's mandate of judicial review was born. And as the highest court in the country, decisions made by the Supreme Court are final. That is, unless a future Supreme Court finds that decision unconstitutional. One well-known example of this was the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This overruled the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which had legally protected segregation as separate but equal. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, all other courts must follow this precedent. Unlike the President or Congress, courts only act if someone brings forward a valid case. And unlike the legislative and executive branches, the judicial branch operates outside of elections and voter input. But it nonetheless has a profound effect on our daily lives, by evaluating the constitutionality of laws to keep our government in check. To see how the legislative branch checks the president, check out our video on the legislative branch.
Okay, so again, you hear that Marbury versus Madison is so important in establishing the framework, right, for the role of the Supreme Court. That is the Supreme Court's job to interpret the Constitution. So they are, in essence, the ultimate authority on the Constitution. And what they say goes when it comes to interpreting laws in cases and how it applies to the Constitution. So it is a very, very big role that they hold. All right, let's take a look at number 5 really quick. Why are Supreme Court rulings so important in establishing legal precedent? They are the final say when it comes to the Constitution issues. So unless Congress passes a law changing things federally and within constitutional bounds, what the Supreme Court rules is it. Because what they say happens. It doesn't matter how much you protest, how much I'm going to elect in somebody else, that doesn't matter. What they say, at least for the time being, until another case dealing with a similar issue makes it to the Supreme Court, it stands and stuff. So it can take decades sometimes if to have a revisit of a topic or something that's like a really hot topic. Yeah. So it's very final. We need that consistency, someone to solve the issue and, make a decision, but it's always a smooth process. Okay, let's go over to the checking for understanding. The primary purpose of the courts in the United States is to interpret and imply existing laws. So the courts are not making laws, they are interpreting and applying laws, saying, yes, this works, or no, it doesn't, or it works in this definition. So sometimes it's interpreting a law correctly or the way it's being applied. The Supreme Court has jurisdiction over cases involving all the following except, so federal law, U.S. Constitution, foreign treaties. They do not have jurisdiction over state laws. The framers were given on many details, the framers were vague on many details of the judicial branch, leaving those decisions to the elected branches of government, okay? So with time, we have seen interpretations and how we apply things change with the elected bodies, with progress. So the way we applied certain verbiage 200 years ago on the early stage of this country are very different than necessarily how we apply them today, depending on who we're electing and how we view the world. What are the constitutional requirements for becoming a federal judge? I don't know about you, this shocked me when I first learned this, okay? There are none. There are none. You don't have to have experience in the lower courts. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen. You don't have to have a law degree. What? How do you not have to have a law degree? How come I have to have a teaching degree and license, be specialized to teach you government, but somebody who, now, most of them are and most of them do, so don't get me wrong, but that's crazy that it wasn't like written down. Anybody else? Like, I'm not saying you have to have a history degree to like teach you government and stuff, but it's nice, right? Like it would make sense. But I mean, a sub doesn't have to have it, but so I can run the government. Evidently so. So, I mean, now obviously to be appointed, you have to get on their radar, right? So all right, bye. Yeah, you're like, peace out. So you have to get on their radar and stuff. So again, this isn't really a problem, but I just still find it crazy that it wasn't written down. You know what I mean? That it's not a requirement. That really should be written down. Okay, yes, go ahead, Ladybug.
So you're telling me they don't take like a special test to be in the government field? Like, so they could at least, even if they're not an American citizen, they could know some American history?
Nope. What they do though, so this is why we have that process where, I froze up. Okay, this is why we have that process though, where the president appoints and the Senate approves. So what the Senate does is in essence interrogates them, grills them, what do you know about this? What do you know about that? What's your experience? So if they don't approve them, then the president has to nominate someone else. So that's why we have that process. It's kind of like an interview process to hopefully make sure that they are at a minimum qualified. Now, oftentimes, if it's a more liberal judge, then conservatives won't like them, or vice versa. If it's a more conservative judge, then liberals won't like them. But at least, to make sure, like, is the person qualified? Do they have some experience? Especially when you're talking about the higher courts. I mean, you want people that are more experienced, people who know what they're doing. Okay, last question. Supreme Court justices must be confirmed by, and that's the majority of the US Senate. So this is the one filtration we do have in there. So while there's no bare minimum, it's pretty impossible for that to happen because the Senate's just not going to allow that. Like anyone worth their grain of salt is like, why would I vote for you to be a judge when you don't have you don't have experience and stuff. So, so it's not really something you have to worry about, but it is pretty funny to me that it wasn't written down, right? You're like, of all the things you didn't write down. Okay, let's go to the next section. So inferior courts. So we're going to spend a minute kind of talking about some of the lower courts and how they're categorized, okay? And if we look at the notebook, why is it important for the federal government to have separate courts in addition to the Supreme Court? What purpose does the U.S. Court of Appeals have? All right, so let's take a look at these sections really quick. So Congress has recreated two different kinds of federal courts. They've created constitutional courts and then special courts. Okay, so constitutional courts are referred to, all this is referred to in Article 3 of the Constitution, okay, going over the courts. All right, so some constitutional courts would include like courts of appeal, where you're questioning a law or interpretation of a law, or the Constitution, district courts, and international trade. Now, the other courts, the special courts, okay, which are based on categories, so you either have to fit into a certain kind of type of the population, or you have to fit a certain criteria to go to these courts. So they're pretty self-explanatory. U.S. Court of Appeals of the Armed Forces, so obviously that would be military cases, okay? U.S. Court of Appeals for veteran claims, so veteran services. U.S. Federal Claims, Tax Court, so that would obviously be something with the IRS, paying your federal taxes. Territorial Court, so that would be like boundary, state lines, or county, or things like that. And then there's a special court in the District of Columbia, which is our federal capital, but isn't actually a state. So they have their own court, because what happens if crimes are committed within this region that isn't technically a part of a state? Okay. So number 6, why is it important for the federal government to have a separate court in addition to the Supreme Court? It takes the large number of cases off the Supreme Court roster, so it allows for cases to be heard in a timely manner. If there weren't different levels, think how inefficient that would be. So we're on number 6, part 1. So there's just too many cases, and the Supreme Court can't keep up with that. So we need these lower courts in order to make sure that cases are moving along at a decent pace. And even then, I don't know if you ever like watch Dateline or some of those shows and you hear how long it takes some of these cases to go to trial. It takes years sometimes, and you're like, that's fast, that's speedy. Like, imagine if we didn't have as many courts as we do. Yeah, it would be ridiculous. And depending on the severity of the crime, sometimes people have to stay in prison while they're waiting trial. Now, if you're accused of murder, no offense, I would prefer you wait in prison. You know what I mean? But still, is that fair for it to take years? You know what I mean? Like, because you aren't technically guilty, right? Innocent till proven guilty. Okay, so then we need that to go, because if they are innocent, then you're wasting years of that person's life and they don't deserve to be there. So it is a very fine line, right? It's a very fine line. What purpose does the U.S. Court of Appeals have? And it's to look at decisions of the lower federal courts and ensure that no constitutional provisions or violations occurred, okay? So oftentimes it's not the actual decision that they're looking at, was something denied during the process. So for example, if I was on trial for murder, okay, I know I watch too much Dateline, clearly. All right, I love the murder shows. I just do. Anybody else like the murder shows? I just do. Like, so I love it. My husband will come in the room and he's like, oh my gosh. I'm like, I know, it's great. So yeah, the Law and Order, like I love the crime shows. So anyways, let's say that they presented evidence that wasn't allowed, or the line of questioning, or there was an issue with the jury. So it wasn't necessarily that I wasn't guilty of the crime. If I was found guilty, there was something about the trial that compromised it, right? Or that my rights weren't respected. Then I could appeal. And if the courts found that my rights were violated, they could declare a mistrial, or they would have to retry it and stuff like that. So a lot of appeals are not necessarily, but they can have an impact on the verdict. Something, maybe the way it was presented, could unfairly influence a jury. So there's a lot of reasons that people can appeal, and the goal is to try to show or to say that somehow your rights were violated or weren't honored. Okay, any questions on any of that? Okay, give me a thumbs up. You've got 4, 5, and 6 done. We're going to move to the primary source. We're doing really good on time. Awesome, awesome. Okay. And again, if this is being watched in class, you can always pause this in between to give you time to write down the answers to those questions, okay, that I'm providing. All right, so we're going to go back over into Canvas. All right. And we're going to go to next, and we're going to look at the primary source. So remember, the primary source is a document or something dealing directly with the topic. So in this case, it's the federal court system. And the document we're going to be looking at this week is Marbury versus Madison. One way or another, you're going to remember this court case. All right. It is really important. You got to remember this court case. All right. So as we go through, we watched a video on it and stuff, and then I will help you summarize it. Okay. So that's one nice thing about doing it in class is we do help shorten the amount of time a little bit. Okay, let me go over to the worksheet. Scroll down. Okay, so description or title. This is Marbury versus Madison. So it's the opinion. So what happens is when the courts make a decision, they release an essay basically about their opinion. So they're ruling. This is, we ruled for or against whatever the court case is. Okay, and then why? So there'll be the majority opinion, which one judge will put out. This one was unanimous, so everybody agreed. But when sometimes we don't agree, if there's a justice that doesn't, they'll put out what's called the dissenting opinion. So the minority opinion, meaning the not winning opinion for why they object. Now, it doesn't mean they win, but it's just for the record, all right, in full disclosure. So Marbury versus Madison, this is an opinion or court ruling on the case of appointing judges and the role of the Supreme Court. So concept or unit, that is, what is this lesson about? So this lesson is about judicial review and how the Supreme Court gained that authority, okay? Unique features. So what makes this document unique, okay? It's an opinion of the courts that gave itself power powers that neither of the other branches objected to. So what was really interesting about this is this was foundational because it declared, it kind of changed the role of the Supreme Court. Up to this point, they were interpreting law, right? Helping interpret, here's what it means, and clarifying that. Because sometimes it's like, okay, well, I read this, but what does it actually mean? In this case, they gave themselves authority to override the other two branches if must be. And the other two branches didn't object. So that tells you something. That they would be the ultimate authority on interpreting the Constitution, which is our supreme law of the land, right? The Constitution is basically our set of laws that all other laws must follow. And it is the most powerful entity in, so it is above the president, is above the legislature, is above Supreme Court. We are supposed to refer to and follow that when in doubt. So new vocabulary. Original jurisdiction. We talked a little bit about jurisdiction, remedy. So jurisdiction can be a lot of different things. Like I said, sometimes it's territory, where something happened. It can also be things like if you're in the military or if you're a veteran or if it's a tax issue. So maybe depending on how you're classified or the issue that's at hand, that might specifically send you. So if it's tax issue, you're going to go to a tax court. If you're in the military, then you're going to go to a military court. So sometimes they're specialized as well. So what is this about? Okay, well, the Chief Justice Marshal spells out 3 questions the court needs to consider in this case. We'll go through them. So first is how the applicant has the applicant a right to the commission he's demanding. Okay, so do they have a right to the job? If he has a right, and that right has been violated, do the laws of the country afford him a remedy, meaning a solution, an outcome, a way to fix it? And then if they do afford them a remedy, is it a madras issue from this court? So meaning like, is it our authority to fix? So basically whether or not the courts have the power to rule on those questions. So the justice goes on, Chief Justice Marshall goes on and creates creates the power of judicial review based on a couple of powers that the Supreme Court has seen in Article 3 of the Constitution. So I'll copy and paste this in a couple of different sections. So something new that we're starting this week, all right, and when you do it with me, I will provide it to you, is that it says add a quote that reflects the main point of the document. We're going to put that in the what is it about section and stuff. So here's your quote, okay? And the goal is just that we're making sure that we're pulling direct evidence for our summaries, okay? So it's going to be part of the rubric starting this week. So the Constitution vests the whole judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress shall, from time to time, ordain and establish. This power is expressly extended to all cases arising under the law of the United States, and consequently, in some form, may be exercised over the present case, because the right claimed is given by a law of the United States. So oftentimes justices' decisions are long, they're complicated, but basically they're giving precedent, they're giving reasoning. It's kind of like you writing an essay and you're trying to convince, right? You're picking an opinion, yes or no, or an opinion on a topic, and then you have to give evidence. So in the same way, justices can't just say yes or no, they have to give evidence, right? Just like the idea of I'm innocent till proven guilty with evidence, right? So in the same way, if justices are making decisions, these opinion papers are important and that they are explaining in detail how they came to their conclusion, proving, at least justifying in their mind how they are following the Constitution. Here's where I pulled it from. Here's precedents. Here's previous case. Here's how I came to this conclusion. Here's how I justify that I'm not just doing it because I like it or doing it because I'm being paid to, right? Bribery, but that I'm actually being honest and I'm making an impartial decision. So then explains in the last section that if the founding fathers had wanted other branches, let me put this, so this is the last what is it about section. He explained that if the founding fathers had wanted the other branches to have jurisdictional power, such as that of the Supreme Court and other courts as created by Congress, then they would have given those powers in the Constitution. So ultimately, it's like, listen, we're the only one that's even close to having review. You know, Congress gets to pass laws. The president, is over the military and gets to approve the laws and this and that, but there's nobody to impartially review and say, hey, did you have the right in the first place? Or are we getting too political? So the Supreme Court, that's their authority. They're not running for a position, so they don't have to please everybody. They don't have to get donors. They're supposed to be impartial. And as the waves of politicism come and go, Democrats come and go, the extremes come and go, they are supposed to remain steady and interpreting it as unbiased as possible. Now, obviously, there's always going to be an element of bias. We're all biased in our own ways, okay? We have our beliefs, our opinions, and of course, it influences us, but they have to find precedent and they have to follow the law. And sometimes they have to go against what they believe because it clearly states, and so that's why we need them. So bringing it all together in the ruling that Congress had passed, let me stick this over here and then I'll read it to you. This is the bringing it all together, okay, summarizing it. In the ruling that Congress had passed a law that they had no power right to pass, the Supreme Court ruled the constitutionality of the acts of Congress. This created the power of judicial review that the courts still use today. So they have the right to overrule other courts, to overrule Congress, okay, when they've made a law. The implied power, so implied, remember, so expressed is where it's clearly stated. Implied is kind of like, so for example, if I buy a car, it's implied I got to put gas in it, so they're taking this as, well, here's clearly what it states in the Constitution that the courts do. So based on this, it's implied that when we go against that it is our job to correct that, okay? Implied came from having original jurisdiction on cases involving federal appointments and federal laws. All right, how are we doing? Questions? Give me thumbs up or you're with me. You've gotten 4, 5, 6, 7. We've done the last 4. Okay. So what we're going to do is you are going to complete 8 and 9 on your own. Okay, you're going to complete 8 and 9 on your own. All right. So you don't have to do the full paragraph. You can do one paragraph. Okay. So you don't have to do 2 paragraphs. Sorry, you can do 1 paragraph. Okay. But you will complete the journal and you will complete the thinking about what you really know. You will complete those 2 on your own. Okay. Going back over into Canvas. We'll go to next. So here's the journal, and they give you some more information that you can use, okay? And then the question you're coming back to, what are the negative effects of considering political leaning when selecting Supreme Court justices? And this is for sure. So Democratic presidents, they're going to pick more liberal judges, people who have a more liberal record. Republican presidents are going to pick a more conservative justice. So even on the Supreme Court, as much as they're supposed to be unbiased, they definitely lean one direction or another, okay? And they're going to be selected by the president because maybe their history falls in line with more the politics or the views of that party. So even in the Supreme Court, you're going to see bias. You're absolutely going to see it, okay? Right now, the courts lean more conservative. Why? Because there have been more conservative judges appointed than liberal. And it's just a pendulum going back and forth. So as positions open, when someone leaves or passes or dies or is removed, whoever's present gets to appoint. So for example, like President Trump appointed 3. That's like almost unheard of, okay? Normally a president's lucky if they get to appoint 1. So to have multiple positions open up in one presidency, that is, I guess from the party perspective, that's good, right? If you're more conservative, yay, because you get to put more conservatives in there. If you're a liberal, then you're like, because that's a lot of, because there's 9 positions on the Supreme Court. So to have 3, that quickly shift and stuff, that's a big influence and stuff. So, but for sure, President Obama appointed judges, Clinton appointed judges, George W. Bush appointed judges and stuff like that. So President Biden appointed our most recent judge. So every president does them, or most of the time does it. It's rare, most of the time, especially if they serve 2 terms and stuff like that. But to have multiple, that definitely plays to the advantage of whichever party, because again, judges, they're going to select people who tend to lean more liberal or more conservative. So it will happen. Okay, let me go down. So you're going to do your checking for understanding, and you're going to do this part on your own. And again, that's to check the vocab. Okay, so to check the vocab, which we went over in part 2, but to make sure that your application of it, and again, oftentimes this can be one of the questions on the quiz, right? So the checking for understanding is a great way to review for your assessment. Okay, and then you submit your notebook. Okay, and stuff. So you submit your notebook. There's the rubrics. And then you take your quiz on the next page. Okay, you take your quiz on the next page. So let me give you the review sheet that goes with, where was it? Okay, here it is. Let me give you the review sheet. So I'll put this in the chat. Okay, so here's the review sheet. Now, if you're watching this back, okay, again, because I'm out or something, then the way that you find it is you go to modules, and it is posted on the lesson and recording page for this week. So you go to week 7 on the lesson and recording page, and you will find the review sheet. So there's module 2, lesson 2, 1, and then module 3 or module 2, lesson 3 review sheet right there. Okay. So if you're watching this back, that's where you always find the review sheet, is on the weekly lesson and recording page. All right, did it open? Let me know. Did it open for you? Did it open? Don't all respond at once. It's okay. It opened? Okay. Thank you. All right. So again, as usual, so I've outlined the key vocab. So remember, if you want to make alterations to it, you can do File, Make a Copy, and you can save it to your government folder and stuff. So if you want to make any adjustments to this, just File, Make a Copy, and then you can add definitions if you want or something like that. Okay. Yes, Tamia, did you have a question?
We do number 8 and 9, right? Or
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. I got rid of them last week because we were doing the project, stuff like that. But unfortunately, that's not a weekly thing. So I know you guys would not be sad if it was. You would not be sad if it was. Okay, so there's the vocab. There's notes from each page of the lesson. And then I go in there and I take those checking for understanding questions. So like here, to get a case to the Supreme Court, here's the steps. Remember, we went over that 3 options. And then those checking for understanding questions will fall under that. So the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over all the following except state laws. The framers were vague and stuff, leaving those decisions to the elected branch. So those are in here. What are the constitutional requirements for being a federal judge? None. So those checking for understanding questions that we went over, you find them on here. Okay. So list some of the special courts. And again, this isn't everything, but it's a good summary. Also, I found a quick, just 2-3 minute video. So if you need that review of the Marbury versus Madison, which is the whole foundation of this whole lesson, right? Setting the precedents for judicial review. Then I linked the video there, a quick, just kind of summary of Marbury versus Madison, okay? Which we watched yesterday and obviously was referenced today in the video, okay? So we have some time left in class. So what I would say, I'm going to stop recording here in a second so this doesn't go on and on and on. So what you can do with the additional time is work on 8 and 9, okay, getting those in, getting those done. Also remembering that your superhero project is due Friday, okay? So for this Friday, you know, that superhero project, that is due this Friday, okay? So once that goes in as missing, your grade will drop. So you really want to get that in, okay? The notebook and the quiz that we're working on right now, those are due on Monday. All right. So we have this week and we have next week's assignments, and then that's going to be the end of quarter 1. So module 2, lesson 4, that will be the last lesson that we're going to do next week that will go in for quarter 1. Okay. Everything is closing. Anything that's still open will close on October 2nd. Okay. So again, less than 2 weeks, you know, 2 weeks from this past Monday. So it is really important if you're bringing up your grade and stuff like that, that you get that in as quickly as possible. I will be sending failing notices this Friday. Okay. So I will grade first thing in the morning. And if you have under 70%, you will be getting, this will be my final failing notice for the quarter. I've sent 3 others. All right. So kind of time to get it in gear or accept the fate. Okay. And then this is just, don't leave yet. So to everybody else, but this is just so I can stop the recording. And then if you need anything and stuff like that, because there's sub today, if you have questions, come see me on Friday between 9 and 11. I am available. Okay. I'm going to stop recording.